right, Linda, welcome to Out of Consensus. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, Linda, you are a development economist. You covered emerging markets, China, the Belt and Road Initiative. For all people that don't know you yet, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a development economist by training, so I look at everything that has to do with trade, investment. I'm interested in industrialization, transformation of the economies. My focus has been specifically on Africa. I spent 4 years in East Africa before moving to London and working for a research organization. And also on China, because I spent some time in China. I've been studying Chinese for many years, and so on and so forth. So bringing these two things together, my sort of development angle and the focus on Africa, and then the focus on China, and then I've expanded that to look at China as a global presence, or China's global role, especially in low middle income countries.
Great. And, now that we are celebrating, you will watch this obviously closely, the 10-year anniversary now of the China Belt and Road Initiative, and looking at it, looking at the African, exposure here, like, what do you see?
Well, it's a very interesting thing to consider, right? So the Belt and Road, we sort of set a starting point in 2013, hence the 10-year anniversary this year, because that's when it was first announced. But at the beginning, it didn't include African countries as such. So in Africa, we had a slightly different policy that was focusing on infrastructure and on industrialization, and it had a different name. But when the Belt and Road sort of expanded to cover more and more countries, and more countries signed Memorandum of Understanding, we see a massive increase in the participation of African countries, specifically around 2018, 2019. And there we see not a particular change in the quality of the work or of the lending or of China's presence. It's really just a transformation of the policy that China was using before in the African context that morphed into becoming Belt and Road. In practice, what does this mean? It means the previous trends continued. So investment that was plateauing already before the Belt and Road Initiative sort of came into Africa, continued to plateau. So we have seen a sort of like a leveling of Chinese investment in Africa in the past 5 years. Similarly, in terms of the lending, we haven't seen like the massive lending that we saw, a few years back. We haven't seen it in the past 2-3 years, partly due to COVID, but also due to the fact that the Chinese policy banks have been a lot more careful about the way they lend. So we see a general trend of, I think, slowing economic interaction after the initial boom in the 2000s and 2010s. And then we see a sort of a engagement that maybe changes and is diversified a little bit. So not so much the state presence with the policy banks, but maybe more, sort of commercial presence, different types of lending, different types of financial flows, and so on and so forth. So we really see a quality change that I would say has little to do with the Belt and Road itself and more to do with how the Chinese economy has changed and the global challenges that it has faced.
And these commercial interests then that are a little bit like, have moved away a little bit, let's say, from a, political angle, like in which industries or where do you see like the highest exposure?
I mean, it's the main source of investment in Africa remains natural resources for many investors, not just for Chinese, but also for others. But we see that the Chinese have a much more diversified portfolio, especially in terms of FDI, foreign direct investment. So they invest in not only in natural resources, but also in construction. That's a very big market for Chinese construction companies. African countries are a very big market. And they also invest in industrialization, in manufacturing, in special economic zones and all activities related to that, as well as agriculture and agribusiness. If we compare that with investment from other countries, is a lot more concentrated in the services sector and in the natural resources sector. So we see that Chinese investment is a lot more diversified and can potentially lead to a sort of a diversification of African economies, which I think is sorely needed.
And do you see any, is there any interesting case study where you see, oh wow, this is really interesting to look at, and there might be like, you know, a lot of opportunities because there was a lot of groundwork done by Chinese companies, and I see opportunity here.
Surely there's a lot of interest in the energy sector. I mean, that's really a big gap that African countries still need to fill, especially if you want to industrialize or if you want to develop economic activities. You still have power shortages in many countries. So it's a problem of generation, it's a problem of transmission, and so on and so forth. So Chinese companies have been leaders in renewable energies, solar, and so on for many years. And we know of projects, for example, in Ethiopia, around renewable energies, wind farms, and so on and so forth. Of course, many Chinese companies are still involved in other traditional types of the traditional type of energy projects. There's a lot of hydropower, a lot of investment in hydro going on, and so on and so forth. There's a little bit of investment in coal still, I think. But in general, I think the renewables is a very exciting space for African continent because there is a lot of market to be filled there.
All right. And if you nowadays go to any kind of African city, I mean, you see pretty much China everywhere. I think you can't really miss it. And the idea is obviously always, and you mentioned this before, that this leads to going up the value chain, industrialization in of many sorts. Like, what do you see there?
I mean, so first of all, the first point, like the fact that you see China everywhere, I think it's really interesting because this is the sort of perception that we all have, right? Oh, there's, everywhere you turn, you see like a Chinese, construction site or something like that. But of course, China has been a big lender in the continent, so they have spent a lot of money building Africa's infrastructure. But if we look at investment particularly, China remains the 5th largest investor. So it's not the largest in terms of FDI stock. So we have, I think UK is the first, according to the latest data. UK, France, Netherlands, US. I don't remember the order in particular, but China is only the 5th, really. So the reason why we see China is so evident is just because its presence has grown so much. So we sort of give it for granted that there's an American company or that there is a French company operating somewhere in Africa, but the Chinese ones are new and they strike us. In terms of whether that has helped, I think Chinese have had substantial investment specifically in certain countries in Africa. So it's quite concentrated actually, but in special economic zones or industrial zones, for example. So that has helped a lot industrializing the continent. So they've built not only the infrastructure, but they've also brought in firms from China to actually populate these zones and kickstart economic activity there. Of course, these zones are open to all sorts of investors, but there's a lot of Chinese investors who are interested. And this is interestingly not necessarily geared at exporting from Africa, but really at serving the African market, where there's still a huge need for a lot of goods that are produced and that are, a little cheaper than what you can get from outside, basically.
Interesting. And you mentioned this before that like Western, I mean, however you want to kind of like define it, investments are more in the service industry. Like, can you maybe put some numbers to it? Like, or like some, let's make this a little bit more granular, just that we understand this a little bit better.
Of course. So let me look for some data. I had, sort of worked on this. Earlier last year was in November, actually. Every year we have the Africa Industrialization Day. And so normally, we sort of look into some data for that. Let me see if I can find it. But basically, what I try to do is to look country by country, the main investors in Africa, and see how the investment is divided. And sure. Again, this is FDI data, not lending data, right? So
yes, but no portfolio flows. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, or give us a little bit like a breakdown of the trends, because I do think this is quite interesting and might lead to like loads of kind of different opportunity set.
So I've looked into the different national statistics offices from the main investors. I found disaggregated data for UK, France, and US, not for the Netherlands, and then for China. So for the out of the 5 biggest investors in Africa, I have data for the 4 largest ones. So UK The main investment was in mining and quarrying, the main sector, 48%, financial services, 40%, and then another 12%, right? So we're talking about like an almost equal split between mining, natural resources, and then financial services in Africa. The French FDI was a bit more diversified. Mining is around 40%, financial services around 15%, and then a few of the other sectors. US, similar, 40% for mining, but also interestingly, 15% in manufacturing. And then China, we see construction, 35%, mining, 21%, manufacturing, 14%. So similar to the US, actually. But also financial intermediation, leasing and commercial services, and so on and so forth. So it just looks more diversified. It has a higher preeminence of the construction sector. So presence of construction companies building Africa's real estate, but also infrastructure, of course. And then manufacturing as a very important one, similar to the US, actually, in this case.
I see. And if we look at it like across the board in terms of, trade, obviously, like Africa is becoming very connected, right? I think that's like, the infrastructure is increasingly there. Do you see this? Because you quickly, before we hit the record button, you mentioned the trade is now something that, you find is very, very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Africa is increasingly connected, but it still has a very long way to go.
Right.
So the infrastructure financing gap, I think the latest estimate I've seen is something like, between 70 and $100 billion per year. So the gap, so the finance that's still missing there. So it's really huge. And if you look at a map of Africa, there's, like a few areas where infrastructure corridors are there, especially transport corridors are there, but there's still very big gaps. Now, what African countries are doing at the moment is they're negotiating their continental free trade area that will eliminate domestic barriers to trade. So for African countries to trade more with each other, and that's thought to, help diversify trading relationships, but also economic activities and overall boost African economies. The problem is it's all good and well that you can trade between Lagos and Nairobi, but if you don't have the infrastructure to do that, then you're not going to be able to do that. And I'm not just talking about roads, of course, it's very difficult, but also the ICT infrastructure that's needed for trading services, or the airport services, and so on and so forth. In some cases, when you're traveling in Africa, if you want to go from East to West Africa, for example, it may be easier to travel back to Europe and then down to Africa again, rather than having an internal connection. It really is a market that's underdeveloped there. So in that sense, for sure, Chinese companies have played a role. They have helped develop this infrastructure. Of course, there's a lot of issues there. There's some projects that haven't been as successful as one would have wished for. But still, what Chinese players are doing is they're filling a gap. Now, it would be great if it wasn't only the Chinese, if it was also others that would get involved into this into this sector supporting Africa's infrastructure development.
And you mentioned ICT, like I suppose like that China is playing quite a big role there. Is that correct, or like I'm just like getting my intuition wrong here?
Yeah. Yes, for sure. I mean, no, this is definitely true. I mean, China has been building infrastructure, ICT infrastructure in African countries. They've been getting contracts, in several different countries across Sub-Saharan Africa, across North Africa. It's definitely something that's very much of interest and that's needed to modernize African economies. And that's also now sort of considered part of the digital Silk Road. So the part of of the Belt and Road that sort of, expands digital infrastructure.
So when I sum this up now, what you are pretty much saying is, okay, so China is quite a big player, but it's not as big as the West often perceives it to be. And there might be a little bit of a smear campaign sometimes because not every Chinese company is backed by the state or has like political interest, but they have the commercial interests as well. When you look ahead, right, and correct me if I'm wrong on my kind of little summary, two-sentence summary, like what do you see? What kind of like, what do you forecast when we look at the next, 5 years, let's say, of the Belt and Road Initiative, or, just like call it differently, because they are, as we mentioned, developments that have been happening anyway. We just like now label it differently. So what do you see?
I think that regardless of the labels, Africa is going to remain a very important market, simply because it's a market that needs so many things that others can offer, that, it's going to remain like a very important point for foreign companies. Now, let's also remember that not only China is not the biggest player in Africa, also Africa is a very small market for China. Chinese companies are a lot more active in Asia than they are in Africa, for example. So Southeast Asia, Central Asia, you see a lot more Chinese presence. Anyway, aside from this, I think Africa remains a very interesting market. We see a changing economic conditions in China. So we see a sort of slowdown of the economy, sort of, like cooling down, basically. But some factors that were very important in China's outward expansion remain. So the infrastructure overcapacity, for example, remain. There's a lot of infrastructure companies that need to find profitable projects that are not available in China at the moment. So because that remains a factor, at the same time, you have less availability of the sources of finance from policy banks, for example, that you had before. So we're probably going to see a continued sort of upward trend, but at a slower pace for the next 5 to 10 years. I think that's what is more likely to happen. So not a complete withdrawal of Chinese companies, not a complete like U-turn, but a slower pace of growth and a more cautious approach towards markets that can be considered more risky, such as African markets.
That's interesting, because I would have expected now the opposite, that like the political kind of like stance actually going, would be higher over the next year, since like now we see the US and Western players are pledging there's, whatever you want to call it, like support or presence. So wouldn't you expect like more of kind of like, counter forces, so to say?
I don't necessarily think that this approach of, sort of the competition is how China views it. For them,
right.
Africa is sort of like a way to fulfill their domestic needs. If this is investment over capacity, then we just shift the investment. But it's not, I don't think it's about competing with the US as much as the US sees, on the other hand, China in Africa.
Sure.
I think the approach for China is a lot more business-based. And in that sense, it has to respond to domestic economic needs, and it's not necessarily driven by political goals, I would say, or, partly, but political goals may be different. For example, there may be need for a specific natural resource in, for example, a specific mineral or metal in China that is available in Africa. So that's when you have the sort of like political need or sort of security need in that sense. But it's not driven by a competition with the United States as much as it is, on the other hand, for the United States.
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit marketing as well from the Western side. That's how it looks. Okay, so before we wrap this up, Linda, do you have any events, data points that you are watching, can be over the next 6-12 months, that are interesting to you and that you think could make a significant impact?
Sure. So we have the Belt and Road Forum later this year. So the 2023 Belt and Road Forum, and that's going to be interesting in terms of the sort of directions where the Belt and Road is heading. And this is not just regarding Africa, but it's more broadly around the initiative itself. So we're going to see whether, there's any change in direction in terms of, sort of climate impacts or social impacts, or whether there's any, steering in terms of how our Chinese companies going to, sort of implement that, and so on and so forth. So there's one that's sort of global. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's going to be interesting is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. So that's going to be next year, I believe. And that's sort of like the place in which commitments about Chinese support to Africa happen and take place, or Chinese directions towards Africa take place. So this is it should be next year. And it should, help set the new direction. It should tell us, commitments, how much China sort of pledges towards African countries in terms of lending, in terms of investment, and so on and so forth, but also like thematically, which areas will be the areas of focus. And
if you would be forced to speculate, what do you expect?
I think it's interesting that we are seeing, so the engagement, as we've talked about, is very much based on the sort of economic and business angles, right? But China also is a development and an aid player. They have their own development agency, they provide grants, they provide, aid and so on and so forth, even though it's slightly different than what, other countries do. And they've recently launched the Global Development Initiative that has a lot more of a developmental focus. So it's interesting to consider, how these sort of things will interact with each other. The development angle, the development aspect with the Belt and Road or with the FOCAC, how they will be, mentioned, what the division of labor will be, if any, whether the GDI, the Global Development Initiative, will continue to maintain this sort of more development-oriented focus, and the FOCAC will be more generic, or whether there will be, sort of a mix in the way, the Chinese players basically deploy these instruments.
Interesting. Okay, Linda, apart from Cassandra, where can people follow your work?
So I tweet quite regularly. So you can find, Twitter, you can find me at Linda Calab, so LINDACALAB. And then I also post on LinkedIn. That's where I normally, post my research and my latest papers and articles.
Fantastic. We will include it in the show notes. Linda, thank you so much. I learned certainly quite a lot. And I think we also gave a good overview of what's happening and what the status quo is. And let's see how this 10-year anniversary will play out. So thank you so much again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers.